So today I have the great pleasure to speak with Bryan Fanning. And Bryan is Professor of Migration and Social Policy at University College Dublin. And we will chat about an intellectual history of the welfare state. Hi, Bryan. How are
Hello.
you today?
I'm very well, thank you so much.
It's wonderful to have you here, Bryan. And first question for you today is, where are you located and what's been keeping you going over the last few months?
Well, I'm in Dublin and I'm at home today working in my little office. I have no teaching today, but a lot of the time I'm in and out of UCD, and we have been teaching face-to-face and online simultaneously, which is interesting and has challenges, but we've learned so much by doing it. So it's a whole new world out there, but we seem to be very much back in operation, and it's great this year to see the students.
Wonderful, Bryan. So, Bryan, you are Professor of Migration and Social Policy in UCD. So could you please tell our audience about this role and what makes you so passionate about what you do?
Okay, so basically I teach on a social policy and sociology degree, where students study social policy, which is the study of how we understand and deal with social problems. It trains public administrators and leaders for NGOs and all manner of organizations and social workers as well. So where I come into this is I'm a professor of migration and social policy. Migration, of course, is about all people coming to Ireland, immigration, which isn't the focus of what we're talking about today. But the other strand of my work is intellectual history. And what unites intellectual history and migration for me is that it requires me getting to think about different ways in which human beings understand the world. So in other words, intellectual history is very much about different paradigms and understandings, be they religious or secular, liberal or conservative in terms of dealing with social problems and issues, whereas migration is also about cultural differences across space. So basically understanding how the world works from the perspectives of different peoples and how they interact and come up against one another is very much part of how I approach the teaching of social policy and how one might think about it in terms of addressing specific issues, topics, problems, and so on and so forth.
I think that moves us perfectly onto your new book, Bryan, which is titled 3 Roads to the Welfare State. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about this.
Okay, this is a book I've been working on and off for a number of years, and it ties in with an awful lot of the teaching I do, which is really about the sort of intellectual history of social policy, by which I mean the ways in which people understand social problems from different intellectual and ideological traditions. The title 3 Roads refers to the 3 main ideological traditions we see at play in the West, in Europe particularly. We see basically conservatism of various kinds. In Ireland, we had Catholic conservatism, and of course there have been many other religious-oriented conservatisms influencing how people think about the world in Europe for centuries. The Enlightenment brought us liberalism, which is a focus on individualism and individual rights and freedoms as a way of thinking about the world and how people should be within it. So basically, and then of course we have also socialism and social democracy. So in terms of thinking about social problems, we find that in various countries, we have different admixtures of liberals, conservatives, and socialists or social democrats vying with each other for influence. But sometimes those conversations take place in the heads of single individuals who themselves might be the product of various traditions. So somebody who grew up in Ireland during the 20th century, maybe in one respect a Catholic, but also something of a classic liberal in the sense that Daniel O'Connell in the 19th century was a classic liberal as well as a Catholic. And somebody in Britain may see the battle mostly as one between conservatism and socialism, or the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, or indeed between basically forms of neoliberalism and social democracy today. So there are various ideological influences at play in terms of how people think about social problems. These fall into sets that can be traced right back to things such as understandings of human nature and ideals as to what life should be about. People are attracted towards one or the other of them often. Different traditions win out as predominant ones in different countries. So for example, Catholicism, hugely influential in Ireland in the past. Social democracy, hugely influential in Sweden, and so on and so forth. So we can see these different traditions kind of set up, if you will, the ways in which people consider social issues. And as I keep saying to my students, the way we understand something tends to shape what we think we can do about it.
Really interesting, Bryan. And I would say there are going to be so many questions about that from our audience. But maybe just to wrap up our conversation, in UCD Discovery, as you know, we're very passionate about interdisciplinarity. So how important would that be to your work?
Oh, absolutely and utterly and fundamentally, because social policy is just merely the study of social problems. In my own department, we have economists, we have historians, we have people who are coming from a sociological tradition. So there are different sort of social sciences all influence and give us different languages for talking about social problems. In terms of this book here, I draw very heavily on political science, on sociology, on philosophy, and to a limited extent theology also, in trying to basically capture how people have thought about and understood social issues and problems within these traditions across the last few centuries. So myself, I see myself as somebody hugely interested, not just in social policy, but in all the social sciences that feed into it. And all of these are in a kind of a meta dialogue with one another anyway. So yes, absolutely, interdisciplinarity is crucial to basically, I think, understanding social problems, just as it is to understanding the world.
Fantastic. So there are lots of questions coming in. So the first one I'll kick off with is, how do you approach writing about such complex topics as you discuss in your book?
My starting place always with is to basically kind of, if you will, try and understand them from the inside out. So in other words, I may not be a socialist, or I may not be a Christian conservative, or I may not be a free marketeer neoliberal. But it's my job, I think, in writing about these different traditions to explain those ideas as they look from the perspective of people who adhere to them. So the way I do that is, I guess, is I read an awful lot about them. I read everything from biographies of the major figures within them. I kind of try and understand their thought, their ideas, their arguments, the evolution of their thinking over time, what they felt was important in their lives, and to try and see the world from those different vantage points. So a term I use often in my writing, or at least in my conversation with myself about writing, is vantage point. We all have our own vantage point upon the world. We can only see the world really from where we stand in relation to it. The present looking at the past, me in Ireland, a middle-aged white Irish man looking out at the world. So there are limits there, but what the glory of reading and the glory of writing is that you can insert yourself imaginatively and creatively, I think, into the perspective, beliefs, values, and worldviews of other people. So if you make a genuine effort to try and understand these, it gives you, I think, basically a vantage point for thinking about the world from outside of yourself. It's not perfect, but at the same time, it offers me a sort of a way in which to try and tell a story, if you will, about the development of the West, generally speaking, over the last few hundred years, in terms of issues that we all face. Everybody faces healthcare issues. Everybody basically faces unemployment potentially as a risk in their society. But the ways in which we think about these issues, the way in which we think about poverty, will be understood differently from different vantage points. So it's my job to be able to explain this to my students. It's my job, I think, to give people the tools for this. And I think the way I would go about it myself is, I would say, within each of these different traditions, there are their own genealogies or histories. So in other words, if I wanted to explain liberalism, I'd probably start off with people like Adam Smith and Robert Malthus in the kind of 18th, 19th century, and explain how those ideas excited and energized a whole bunch of people at a time when individual rights, and individualism as a philosophy was gaining ground, at a time when society was changing radically due to the Industrial Revolution, and so on. At the same time, I might try and capture how those changes are alarming, and how liberalism, or indeed socialist responses to the inequalities kicked off by liberalism and free markets and factories and exploitation in industrial settings, how the socialism, or indeed the liberal individualism, alarmed people who were conservatives, and why they felt alarmed, and what they then tried to do about it, and what kind of countermeasures did they put in place, and how did they also try to appeal to the same audiences. So, for example, I would perhaps discuss how Catholic encyclicals of the late 19th century deliberately mirrored the language of Marx, because they were both speaking to industrial working classes. The Catholics didn't want to lose their industrial working class Catholics of the Italian cities to Marxism. So they basically wrote to them in ways they felt those people would understand. But they also addressed real problems and issues, such as unemployment, inequality, the unfairness of industrial civilization, and all of these things. So pretty much you have these different roads or avenues whereby different traditions are engaging with the same problems. I mean, no matter which city you go into in Europe or the world, you'll find a hospital. You'll find an infrastructure. There'll have to be a grid. So there are these functional necessities that we need, and they're often related to technology. But the ways in which we think about these or structure our conversations about what's good or bad will differ from place to place. Now, obviously, my book is pretty much focused on the European world, or, mostly rather than the entire world. I mean, that's a much, much, much bigger book. But nevertheless, the conversation I have in my book is one within and between countries such as Sweden, the United Kingdom, Ireland to a limited extent, Europe more generally, and of course the United Kingdom.
And Bryan, there are so many questions coming in. This is a really interesting one about migrants. So people have genuine fears that migrants will create a social imbalance. This can happen, but a healthy society should find a new balance. What do you suppose is necessary to avoid a bad outcome?
Well, that's a very complicated question. I mean, immigration is happening now in a way perhaps it didn't happen at an earlier phase in our development in Ireland, because perhaps of social change, technological change, our own economic prosperity. The fact that communications have accelerated around the world, the fact that a journey that might have taken people weeks and cost them huge amounts, perhaps in previous generations, can be achieved relatively simply now. The fact that we're aware of what's going on in other parts of the world and see ourselves as part of the same system. So all of these things basically, are explanations as to why we get more migration. But then at the same time, you'll find people who are alarmed about the pace of change and will need reassurance about that. So it has to be a bit of a dialogue, I think. But ultimately, societies, I think, have their own internal conversations about migration. These tend also to play out in international settings. In Ireland, our response to migration has been mostly fairly benevolent, although much of the research I've done has been about inequalities and things such as racism, which are real things. But at the same time, the argument that migrants are coming to Ireland because we're a relatively prosperous place, that our prosperity is bound up with our own openness to the world. This is something that somebody like Adam Smith would have understood in the 18th century, where he would have argued the division of labor, the fact that people can move around the world, the fact that production becomes more complex, the fact that we all become increasingly interdependent around the world is a good thing. And for that reason, liberals, economic liberals, like immigration. They see it basically as a sign of basically modernization, progress, interconnectivity. Whereas other people perhaps are much more concerned about the sort of impact of immigration on their society at a particular time. So, a lot of the research I've done very recently has been focused on kind of responses to migration by people who disapprove of it. So I've done another book recently, which we're not talking about here today, but you can Google it. And I look at, for example, basically the far right in Ireland and other groups who have reservations about social change, and how in various political systems in the democratic West, including the United States, some of these concerns get pushed to the foreground in ways that perhaps some people don't like. Some people, Trump is a classic example. Brexit is another example. So these anxieties do play out and have to be taken very seriously. So it's a very, very complex question. And I guess someone like me kind of tends to see all of these things as interconnected in some shape or form. But usually these things are best studied in a little piece at a time, because otherwise you can kind of lose your way in the midst of all the complexities that link the world together. Yeah.
Great, Bryan. And actually, to finish up, because we're almost running out of time, there's a lot of questions around Ireland and the modernization of Irish society, and how, I suppose, it's accelerated over the last number of years. But here, I'll just read you a very quick question. It feels like the modernization of Irish society has been extraordinary, not just financially and technically, but also culturally, particularly over the last 30 years. And I suppose, to finish, Bryan, would you agree with this statement?
Oh, absolutely and utterly. I mean, there's a novel by a guy called L.P. Hartley, which says the past is a foreign country. And indeed, Ireland's past is increasingly a foreign country to people who are, if you will, of the current generation. So Ireland was very religious. It's now less religious. That's one. Ireland is mostly urban. It used to be mostly rural. Ireland used to be mostly quite conservative. Now it's basically socially very liberal. We've seen changes in terms of marriage equality and on many other issues that would put us very much at the vanguard of social liberalism in the Western world. So these are huge changes. The thing I would sort of say about it is that Ireland's journey along this pathway has been broadly similar to many other countries, but has its own distinctive characteristics. In terms of the ideas in the book, I would say we have kind of come out of a time and place where the very modernization of Irish society, the people who gave us our mass education system, the people, if you will, who educated all of us in the 19th century to believe we were the same people with the same culture, was a Catholic system of schools. But that kind of Catholic idea of the nation has been superseded gradually since the 1960s by secularization. And with secularization comes different ways of thinking about what it is to be a human being. For example, issues such as abortion, marriage equality, all of these kinds of issues are fundamentally come down to philosophical questions and questions of belief and values. And to some extent, these beliefs and values have changed. So, many of the debates that play out in my book, Three Roads to the Welfare State, across 2 centuries, have indeed played out in Ireland in a very accelerated pace as well in the last generation or so, where pretty much each of the 3 value sets is present. There were conservatives, and there are some people, of course, still who are conservative. There are people who are socially liberal, and at the same time, there are people who are very keen on markets, on free markets. And of course, there are also an increasing number who are drawn back to socialism and social democracy as ways of curing as what they see are the ills of capitalism. So yeah, these ideas and these conversations that we're having now at an accelerated rate in Ireland are part and parcel of a repertoire of conversations that peoples in Europe have had for generations. So I think, it's useful, interesting, and exciting to be able to think about these things or understand how people come at this from the various angles and the various schools of thought, what I call the 3 different roads that people have taken, from the past to the present in towards the future. This is a road from tradition to modernity in various ways, shapes, and forms. Yeah.
That's incredible, and what a wonderful intellectual whirlwind tour almost of your book. Delighted, and I hope it's available. The link we'll send out, the link is available on our website to anybody who's interested. So we're unfortunately completely out of time.
Okay.
So sincere apologies to all of you whose questions I didn't get to. I will pass them on to Bryan. But I wanted to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to Bryan for the most fascinating discussion today. Thank you so much, Bryan.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and all the best to all of you, wherever you are in the world today. Take care.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in, and see you all very soon on Zoom for Thought. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.